Hello. How's it
Okay,
going?
so great. But I just want to say that for the first time ever, the timer actually like stopped timing at 0.1 second rather than at like random time. It just throws us into the live stream. So that was amazing. Also unexpected in the
Yeah.
best possible way. How
Well,
exciting. How are you?
I'm good. Welcome everyone back to season 10 of Disasters Deconstructed. As you know, we're live streaming this season. We are on episode 9. Hope you've enjoyed the previous discussions. Our season is focused on the book that we've been working on, Contemplating Catastrophe. We've been meeting with different authors, going through different themes and parts of the world. And we're really excited to continue our discussions again today.
Indeed. And so in the first part of the season, we talked about around themes. And a couple of episodes ago, we kind of moved to the regions. And actually, it's penultimate episode today. So is it such a word? Two more episodes to go.
Make up words, it's okay.
I'm very good at making up words, as you know. This is not my first word that I made up. So anyway, in this penultimate episode, we continue kind of focusing on the regions, and we remain in the east. For those of you who followed us in this part of the season, we've been in the east for a while now, for I think 2 episodes. And joining us today are Aditya Sharan and Jonathan Lassa. Welcome.
Hello, thank you, Xenia and Jason. I'm being an avid listener of the podcast. I think it's very exciting for me to be on it. Thank you very much for inviting.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining, Aditi. I mean, both of you are for the first time kind of joining us on the podcast because, of course, Jonathan and Aditi, we've kind of worked together for years now, and so finally, we managed to convince you. Also, Aditi and Jonathan are in tomorrow already, whereas Jason and I are in kind of yesterday.
Yes.
That always excites me, this is great, the time difference. Fascinating. Anyway, so quick introductions. Aditi Sharan is an early career researcher from India. She's a lecturer of disaster risk management and development at the Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. And Aditi has been working over the years closely with NGOs, community-based organizations, different government authorities, and academic institutions. And she focuses in her research on disaster risk reduction, social exclusion, participatory planning, and decentralized governance mechanisms. And Jonathan Lassa, I'm sure many of you probably know Jonathan's work, as you know, Aditi's work. So Jonathan is an interdisciplinary social scientist with civil engineering background. He's a senior disaster risk scientist at the Earth Science New Zealand and senior fellow at Charles Darwin University in Australia. His work looks at disaster governance, political will, as well as the dreams of resilient future. So a lot to discuss today, and we really look forward to it. Welcome both.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's really great to have this time with you both. And so for this season, if anybody's been tuning in or listening to the recordings, you know that we start with the same sort of prompt with our guests, because this is kind of where we started this conversation that led to this book around reading and like where do people get inspired by. So I want to ask both of you, what do you read? How did you start reading the things that you read, and what inspires you and your work? So let's start with Aditi.
Thank you, Jason. I mean, that's a very broad question. What do you read? I mean, there's so much to say. I think currently I'm being more engaged in the gender, migration, climate change, and that kind of space. So I've been actually rereading a book by P. Sainath called Everybody Loves a Good Route. And
Mm,
it's a classic, but sometimes you have to revisit these old books to sort of rejuvenate your motivation to work in the sector. So I've been engaging a lot with some critical commentary on just displacement, power dynamics, the rural poor, and how a drought might impact their health, their access to resources. So yeah, I've been reading a lot about that, and this inspiration, or how I got into this all, started with my bachelor's when I was doing sociology. And for somebody who was pretty new to the field, I was like 18 years old. I'm reading Karl Marx, I'm reading Weber, I'm, you know, Durkheim, Merton, and all of these people. And when I entered disaster studies, for me, it was personally an applied sociological field. And some people might get upset at me saying that, but uh, but that's my personal opinion, and and I really
Ouch.
saw it as as an applied sociological field, and that has informed a lot of things that I've written or I've worked on. Um, so I think that's where the inspiration also comes from, because then I worked as a practitioner in the field and I could see a lot of these things, roll out in real life, and then a lot of gaps that the theorists say something, the thinkers are talking about something, you can see some relation, and then some very critical gaps that happen at the time of implementation of, say, policies, or just the nature of risk that people understand, which is very different to what we sort of talk about in mainstream disaster studies. So I think that is where the inspiration comes from, and that is where how I select or read different things. But yeah, I've been having a good time reading all of these things. Thank you.
I mean, that's great. Also, sorry, a complete tangent and a question for Jason. Jason, wasn't it the Everybody Loves a Good Drought, the book that we read at one of the conferences, that tells you everything you need to know about academic conferences, and like wrote notes in it? Was it that book?
I don't
So
know.
we went through the stage like about 10 years ago where we would like choose a book and kind of write notes to each other, and that's how we read books. I mean,
I think you might be right. Yeah.
I think it might do that, right? Sorry, you just I haven't thought about this book for so many years, and you reminded me about it. So yeah, thank you. Might go back and read it.
I think that comment about disaster studies being an applied sociological field is contentious.
Brilliant. Yeah, I know.
Like I said, it is my personal opinion.
Completely like move this episode onto that,
No, we
I'd be
now
happy to.
we have to have a debate episode about this. I have some people in mind.
I'm in.
Okay, so Jonathan, let's come to you. Same question.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Aditya, for putting disaster studies as a subset of sociology. Well, that's a good example of how colonial works, because every disciplines wanted to, create a space and, reduce some of the disciplines to be their subsets of things. But I'm not attacking you personally, but it's an illustration of the talk today about how the rest is being, conquered by the others. So regarding what I read Wittgenstein at the moment, because I think I wanted to offer some solutions to the endless debate about whether we need to end the call disaster is natural or not. The term natural disasters. I think we cannot solve the problems without going into the philosophical works. But the more you go into Wittgenstein, then I think you will be going into the colonialist kind of, Western knowledge domination again. So it's, but yeah, I read a lot about colonial works on West Timor, where I come from nowadays. And I think I spent a lot of time reading anthropologists that have been working on West Timor. But just to give you a context, West Timor is like 500 islands alone. It's a very diverse place, and there are plenty of Western scholarship on the islands. So I think I'm trying to read them from time to time to try to understand how they understand us. Yeah, if that helps. Thank you.
That's super. Yeah, it's great. Again, this remains to my favorite question of all times, because it's just very interesting to for us to learn where thinking comes from. And so on that, let's talk about your entries. Aditi, you wrote for us about Homi Baba. Um, you can absolutely blame JC Gayard for kind of nominating you to to write about Baba, and yet you kind of wanted to write about Baba. Why this choice?
So yes, JC did sort of bring into like like the whole idea of using Baba, because I was sort of grappling with the idea of othering, the us
Mm,
versus them, the whole narrative around self versus the other and all of that. And that, like, I was familiar with the work of Baba. Was JC was pretty instrumental in bringing him into my particular work that I was doing. I think after reading and sort of intensely engaging with his work, I realized that there are a lot of uh, theories that he has put forward, and like, especially about hybrid identity, so hybridity, and how negotiations happen between historically marginalized groups and people in power. Um, uh, Through mimicry, and all of these theories sort of made a lot of sense. And to just give a little bit of context who might not be aware of who Homi Bhabha is, he is a pretty critical theorist and one of the most influential people of post-colonial colonialism and post-structuralism from India, and it gives a very good lens to look at societies that have been colonized before and what it means in the contemporary times. A lot of presentations that I've done, and people have asked me that, this is a theory from the 1990s, and how do you think it is still relevant? And it's very exciting and fascinating to see that it is still relevant. And what people were talking about in the like his book Location of Culture came out in 1994, and at even that time, the things that he was talking about, this colonial otherness, or the point of understanding difference uh, from this colonial lens, uh, is still valid, because how the residues of colonialism is still very structured into the policies and plans
mm,
and all these like governance structures is still there. And that is why I think it is very relevant for disaster studies, because in development studies a lot of work has been done with using Baba's theories and stuff, but in disaster studies there is very limited sort of entries, or that lens of using those theories to look at especially vulnerability and agency, because we are also shifting that sort of narrative from vulnerability to agency. So I think that provides a very good point of entry.
mm.
So that is why I wrote on it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I also love how you're saying that 1990s is like long time ago, which shows my age. I feel like it was yesterday. I still remember all the Backstreet Boys lyrics, unfortunately for everyone who lives with me.
Hmm.
But kind of going back to Baba and on a serious note, um, obviously your work, so for those of you who are not familiar with Aditi's work very much pushes the narrative of gender beyond the binary, which and the binary has been dominating the mainstream disaster risk reduction narrative, right? And kind of in policy and practice we see that binary everywhere. And so my question for you is, it's sort of it's two-part question. Well, first of all, do you think Baba's work actually helps us understand gender beyond binary? And if so, how? And also, what other thinkers do you engage with who kind of offer critique to this current very binary narrative of gender as vulnerability in disaster risk reduction?
Yeah. So I think in my own work, for some context, I've been working with the Hijra community of India, which is a non-binary cultural group, and they're pretty much a part of the social fabric of Indian society or Indian culture. And Bhaba's theories make a lot of sense looking at the things that I found from my research, is because they were criminalized under the colonial rule. Uh, just the whole group. Their existence was criminalized under the Criminal Tribes Act, right? And even though that act was sort of lifted after independence, um, the stereotypes that continued with the group still is going, like it is still sort of showcasing in terms of their vulnerabilities, in terms of their access to resources, in their human rights, or just fundamental rights that are, you know, there at power. And it's more visible at the time of disasters. So what I realized was that there are a lot of things that we can take from Baba's work to look at all of these things, like negotiations, or that dynamics of power between the government and the group as such, which is not a homogeneous group. It's still a lot of difference from variations from different parts of the country. India is huge, so we have like different
Mm.
groups and regional variations across the nation, and how then they create space for themselves. So I think Baba's theory on mimicry is very relevant in that, because it shows that people negotiate their space by sort of aligning their identities with what is expected of them. But then, as Baba said, it is like same but not quite. And then in that not quite is where this scope for negotiations, or to, you know, reach out for power, is that where it happens. And
Mm.
that helps them to sort of uh, get access to resources, public schemes, or in on a more practical sort of understanding of it, like just when there's a disaster, there's like how do people sort of, if they are not allowed in evacuation camps because of a certain way they look, or certain documents that they don't have, then what can these people do to sort of negotiate getting those resources or compensations, or, you know, all of that. So I think it was very interesting to see how this um, theory or theories that Baba has presented can be used in gender studies. Of course,
Mm.
it's not in isolation that I only look at Baba. So, as you asked, there were like different thinkers. So, his contemporaries, Gayatri Spivak,
Mhm.
Edward Said, which Jonathan will talk about in a minute, and then Mohanty. So these all these people who have different viewpoints can be used together to so. And more recently, we have Partha Chatterjee, Nivedita Menon, who can sort of complement and add to what Baba is trying to say, but in a more contextual way, and that can be applied in different ways. So I'm talking about a case from India, but then the same thing can be applied in a different context with not, I won't say similar, but similar and different sort of colonial
Mm.
experiences. But overall, broadly, it still becomes really relevant. Yeah.
Mm. Super.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Aditi. So I want to come to you now, Jonathan, and talk us through your choice of writing about Edward Said, and what you're hoping that readers can gain from this entry.
Thank you, Jason. So before going directly to answer the question, I think I'll give you a context regarding my PhD work, because I was inspired by Greg Benkoff and his approach using history to understand the present disaster policy in the Philippines, for example. So I spent sometimes working on 100-year history of disaster policy in Indonesia and Myanmar. And it clearly leading me to see how the past shapes the present and how those can be used to predict the future. And this is quite famous in the institutional thinking. We call it path dependency theory, how we move forward to the future, but we are actually ending up in the past. And that is pretty much aligned with Edward Said's work. That at some point he sounds like historical institutionalism. So his work, like I would say, cultural historical institutionalist in a way, because he traced how the imperial encounters create some kind of enduring structures and showing how they persist in the discourse and practice today. And the other framework that I encountered during my PhD is discursive institutionalism. Now, it's quite funny because if you read Vivian Smith at Boston Uni, she didn't actually make kind of direct citation to Said, but somehow their idea is pretty much aligned. So how discourse can be a rule game or can be a game changer. It sets and shapes society in the context of many disciplines in many society. So somehow they are aligned, but they are not connected. I read more of Stephen Smith during my PhD time rather than Said. But if you look at the Said's work, it demonstrates how powerful discourse is. So discourse is not just language, but it's a social economic practice that help reproduce domination from the past. So I think Said's is kind of being like a strong contributor to that kind of idea, but somehow we didn't cite Said directly. So the second point is that why I wrote about Said is that I grew out of NGO activism in West Timor during late 90s and early the 21st century. It's a period where intellectual activism from Eastern Indonesia was searching for conceptual framework to fuel resistance. So Timorese activists back in time tend to think that they were kind of experiencing double or triple or even more discrimination in Indonesia context. And such a resistance is not against the Western domination, but is rather against the Western Indonesia, in this case, the government as their representative. So even though Suharto regime collapsed in 1999, I think the state hostility towards critical views persisted. And a little bit like in the US at the moment or in the last 50 years, Marxist literature is not popular. In Indonesia, it was forbidden. At any time, the military or the police could confiscate books from the shop if the title suggests sounds like Marxist, even though the book might actually criticize Marxist from the end to end. So faced with this, I think civil society back in time, they had only three options for critical thinking. So one is that they could turn into newly available translations after Suharto fall, and pretty much it's Frantz Fanon or Sartre, the existentialist kind of work. The second, I think we will turn into Edward Said as the option. He has his kind of siblings in Southeast Asia, Syed Hussein Alatas, who wrote a lot of books, including The Myth of Lazy Native. Actually, I wanted to propose Syed Hussein Alatas when you wrote this book, when you edit this volume, but somehow I didn't have the time to suggest. So Edward Said held a very unique place in Indonesian activists from Aceh in the very west of Indonesia to Java, partly because of strong public sentiments against Israel project in the Palestine. Now, my encounter with Said was awkward because coming from West Timor, where Christians are predominant, and many Christians, including my Christian families and friends, kind of very strong pro-Israel, a stark contrast to Western Indonesia public sentiment. Still, I think Said was instrumental in helping us as activists because it offers a very unique lens for the oppressed to understand the oppressor. So this is aligned with the third and the most widely option back in time in Indonesian NGO circles, the Freirean thinking, the pedagogy of the oppressed. Yeah, so we ended up growing up as a hybrid, as a kind of public intellectuals back in time. Now, just to clarify, probably with some of the listeners, that Edward Said probably never worked on natural hazards, but he worked on Palestinian crisis, Middle East war, and literary criticism. And I think he has a lot of to offer to students in disaster studies. And I think in the context of our global conversation around decolonizing disaster studies and research, I think Said can be very relevant. His work on the Orientalism and probably the other one, the culture and imperialism, is I think is very instrumental. They provide some kind of solid theoretical framework to understand how we live in the world where Western paternalism dominates disaster studies, humanitarian studies, and climate change research. And you can see this in a lot of handbook regulations, guidelines, whether you go to Indonesia or you go to the Pacific, you will probably notice if you are trained with critical eyes, I think you will be probably noticing some of the narrative for simple things that is quite famous even in New Zealand, Australia. Disaster is everybody's business or responsibility. Such a such a homogenic common sense, or sometimes it's kind of nonsense, is actually a trap. It's a discourse of responsibilizations of everybody who is probably in the first place not always responsible for risk creation, for example. And also including the climate change, but everyone is pushed to get into the business. That is one of the example why disaster is perceived as kind of business, making it sounds like a moral duty, but it also kind of quietly normalizes disaster as a kind of market opportunity from climate finance, disaster finance, resilience industry, and so on and so on. So I'm part of those industry, to be honest. So such a domination is evidence not only in the centrality of disaster research in the West, but also in the discourse around disaster solutions. So I think I will probably stop at that for the moment.
Thanks, Jonathan. So yeah, I think we're all part of the business in our different ways. And I wanted to just ask you about your work on politics of disaster and political will, because I think although in this conversation we're going to be a subset of sociology, but lots of the field is like more apolitical, hazard-centric, technocratic. And so for a lot of the literature, you know, it's framed that disaster is framed as something apolitical. So I'm just wondering if you're seeing like changes in that, in how disaster is framed in science, and what you're, kind of tell us a bit more about what you work on in terms of politics of disaster.
Right. So I somehow think that we are moving backwards. Not necessarily because we want it that way, but I think it's because the structure of incentive for disaster research are skewed towards one, behavioralism, I would say, because they are apolitical. So they are kind of seen as politically neutral, so they are more preferred. And the second thing is, as usual, they're going into the technology of everything from early warning system to disaster payments to things that you can imagine, including AI and so on. I think we are moving away from that. And I've been working a lot, and I haven't published, but I want to nail some kind of criticism on collaborative governance, for example. Because if you look at across the board from USAID that is now already no longer exists to Australia or many countries, including even multilateral institutions like UN, they offer promotion of collaborative governance, kind of creating incentive to move away for donors and for many players to move away from critical civil society actors. Because in the name of collaborative governance, so again, I call it hegemonic common sense, which is probably nonsense as well, because you always need collaboration with anybody. And for that, we have no dispute. But when they apply collaborative governance as a framework for funding, they move towards certain type of actors that are against the democratic values and do not believe in civil society contribution to discourse making, to democratic kind of value promotion. So at some point, I wanted to blame the decline of democracy in many parts of the world, where this concept of collaborative governance is being promoted. Look at Indonesia. 20 years ago, we were kind of seen as a kind of rising from the ashes, and then a few years later, we were kind of seen as a champion in disaster risk management. But look at what we have today. It's a kind of going back to authoritarian regime again, and the declining of democracy and the suffering of many critical civil society because they are being kind of impoverished in a way. So I would probably promote more research around this front, but the challenge is always you don't have funding for this type of work because it will probably insult governments in the host countries who wanted to exercise their sense of control and authority. So I think that scares away many funding agencies not to get engaged with critical civil society in those countries. So yeah, probably I talked too much by now. Thank you.
No, I think this is super interesting because sorry, I'm just reflecting on what you said earlier, being part of the business, right? And I absolutely agree with Jason that we all are. But at the same time, I think both so Aditya's work and yours, whilst not explicitly, it implies that sort of resistance versus domination, right? In a kind of way that you both portray vulnerability or marginalization on disasters. And I find that framing quite interesting in how even when the domination is so kind of predominant, sort of choice of the better word, kind of right now towards here, there is still those small acts of resistance that maybe are not noticeable. Maybe they're mimicry, right? Like you were talking about Baba's work, right? Maybe there's something that is almost appears at backwards, but resistance nevertheless. And I've been thinking about this quite a lot recently as to what extent resistance can be kind of almost turned in against disastrous creation. And I don't know. This is just sort of something on the back of my mind. And I'd be interested to kind of talk to you more about this at some point. So that's our next book. But for now we'll stick to the one that we have. But talking about the kind of the future, right? What we also ask everyone on the season is a question about hope. Aditya, I'm going to start with you, and I know you told us when we were preparing for the episode that you're the kind of the least optimistic person, but I'm sure there is some hope in you, right? Otherwise, you
Yeah.
wouldn't be working in disasters. So, what is your biggest hope for disaster scholarship and practice?
So this is not an easy question, like I told you before, for me. And given the state of affairs in the world right now, it's very difficult to be hopeful. And I totally sort of echo with what Jonathan was saying earlier. So I think I thought a lot about it actually, and I realized the fact that we're still talking about it is also hopeful. So it also gives hope that the dialogue is at least continuing, and the fact that the people are still working and publishing such critical perspectives on disaster studies is also something that I find very hopeful. Like I mentioned earlier, I was having this conversation with someone earlier this week, and we were talking about how this narrative has sort of been shifting from the vulnerability to agency. And I think that is a very big step in disaster studies, where we are sort of acknowledging the capacities or skill sets of people who have been historically marginalized before, and bringing that as a narrative of the mainstream disaster studies. So I think that is something that I'm very hopeful uh, in the future for it, because I see that the direction is going. But I agree with Jonathan, because in a lot of sense we are still moving backwards, and then like one step forward and again 10 steps backwards. So I think that is a very big challenge as well for the future. But then as long as like we are all part of this, um I won't yeah, like you said, in the business, we are all in the business, so we are trying to do our bits, and as long as we keep doing our bits, I think we'll have something positive to look forward to. Of course, it has nothing to do with me being the most skeptical person on this planet right now, but still. Yeah.
Thanks, Aditi.
Nothing, so not
Jonathan,
all is lost is what I'm trying to say.
not all is lost. New title of our podcast. Jonathan, what about you? What is your kind of biggest hope for disaster scholarship and practice?
Yeah, for Senegal, don't try to unpack the construction of hope. Anyway, so I studied DREAM nowadays, and I have been engaged with officials from Southeast Asia. I had the kind of privilege and the opportunity to train as official from Southeast Asia, ASEAN member states, and also Indonesia. I have been experimenting with this in at least 6 trainings. I asked DREAM, what is your dream? So I use the utopian kind of framework. And I provide the hints that you don't have to think about constraints, just assuming that there is no barriers in your daily operation in the office as an official. What is your dream 10 years from now, 20 years from now, in regards to the disaster risk reduction, for example? You will be surprised by the data. So in one cohort, out of 25 people, only one can dream. So the rest is kind of using blueprints. So they will provide a reference to the national disaster management planning that is set for the next 20 years, and that will be their dream. So their dream is kind of alignment with blueprints that state has provided, because they are not allowed to dream on their own. And that is quite surprising. And when I presented this at CDU back in, I think, 6 years ago, one of the students surprised that, so we are probably governed by people who has no dream at all about a better society. In ASEAN, there was another experiment that also an eye-opening, because we were dreaming about regional cooperation. One of the findings, at least one person out of 20 plus, they said that, well, maybe the dream has been more progressive because the reality has been more progressive, because what you dream for better collaboration is not taking place in Southeast Asia, for example. But I think the rest were very pessimistic with kind of that claim, because in regional cooperation, mainly you deal with this kind of stage. And I've been looking at how officials perform in the stage of regional platforms versus the realities on the ground. But regardless, I think dream more is better than totally pessimistic and have no hope for tomorrow. I think, but yeah, I think I have those data, but I haven't actually managed to finish them all and submit to any crazy journal that wanted to study DREAM, because any reviewers will be think that this is crazy stuff. Anyway, dream more.
I
I
love
love
that.
that.
I
It's
think
great.
we need to do so much more of this. I was going to ask about just the current kind of reactivity of different political leaders and like like backwards movement we're seeing in many societies. And when I look at US where I am right now, it seems like some of that reaction is because of positive progress socially. It's like a reaction to try to prevent society from moving in a certain direction and to like punish the progress. And so to me, that actually gives me hope that, people are the youth of today are actually expecting better for the future, and they're not happy about it. And our leaders are not necessarily happy about this. And so I don't know. Do you think there's truth to that? That's kind of the narrative I tell myself to keep hopeful that the generations coming behind me actually have higher expectations, and the kind of strife that we see now is because those in charge are not happy about this.
I think that's a trend. Sorry, go.
No, Aditya. Sorry,
Yeah, I
Aditya.
think that has been a trend in a lot of places where when there is sort of resistance or people question, there's some sort of debunking happening at different levels. And like you said, the youth is the one who's sort of leading this movement. And whenever that happens, there's always a backlash from the powerful institutions. And that's not only, of course, it's quite visible in some countries as of now, but it's always been like that, like on different levels. But yes, that's where I would say the need to continue talking, like even if it's the issues that we were talking about 30 years ago or two new issues that have been coming out now. I think the idea of continuing the dialogue is very important there.
Like, yeah, for sure. And when I spend a lot of time with Gen Z in the classroom, and they make me very hopeful. Just because they have a lot of dream and vision, right?
Jonathan?
Yeah. So because my task today is on Edward Said, and one of his powerful instruments is discourse analysis. Even though he's not kind of methodologically speaking, he's not behind the critical discourse analysis, but he's instrumental. It's very good example of how you use that CDA to analyze stuff. But I think on the more hopeful front, discourse is just an idea. From an idea to become like an institutions, you need more powerful discursive exercise. And the revivals of the conventional power or the revivality of the past that now seems to be occupying the present, like from the US, Indonesia, and the rest of the world. It's not because they are in itself adequate, but it's because they were able to find value addition from the old narratives that benefit certain groups. And that is pretty much credited to the rise of the discourse that benefits certain actors. So the solution could be working together with Gen Z, who are fed up with all this, racist discourse, whatever, all the bad ideas, push them away. But in order to do that, you need to collaborate with those kind of groups to create a new discursive exercise and, pushing the boundaries, not to kill the old ideas, but, to get good ideas have more space in the society. And we can only achieve that through a better I had this term collaboration with the Gen Z, but that's probably one of the many good ways to move forward. Because good ideas will be more attractive to good people. And I think the planet has more good people, but most of the time we are silent. That's kind of the my take up on this.
Mm. Well, we know from the fairy tales that the good always wins. So, you know, maybe. But it's interesting what you're saying about discourse and how all this discourse is kind of framed around traditional values. You know, I see that a lot now. For example, in the UK, right? I think in the US is sort of similar, like in Russia for sure, that everything that has ever been good was in the past, right? And kind of what's now isn't, and is going back to you know, and I'm using this in kind of quotation marks, like family values and all that sort of hyper masculinity and so very power grounded. Um, and that worries me a lot because values are such a kind of boundary object, right? Like there's such a kind of malleable word that they can be twisted in any way possible. But yeah, this is super interesting. Thank you both. Thank you so much. This has been just really wonderful, and thank you so much for contributing to our book. We really can't wait to see it live. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for supporting us over the years. We really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you for having
Thank you
us.
for having us. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
And
Yeah.
for the rest, for the audience, please join us again on the 1st of December for penultimate episode, where we'll be talking to 2 more of our colleagues about a couple of final thinkers that we would like to discuss. So we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.